Domain expansions are the pinnacle of Jujutsu within Jujutsu Kaisen, but not every character gets one, including a number of strong sorcerers. So today, we are fixing that. I created domains for a number of characters that I thought had the potential to develop one. We're gonna go over the name, the type, the environment, and any effects the domain might have. And honestly, I think a lot of these came out really well. Let's get started with the domain for Yuki Tsukumo. When crafting a domain for someone, there are a few aspects we have to take into account. Their technique, because the domain is the physical extension of a technique, their personality, because the mental landscape of a sorcerer plays a major role in the domain itself, and the strength of a sorcerer, as stronger sorcerers generally have stronger domains with more extreme effects. For Yuki, it's easy to determine her technique and her strength, but her personality is a little bit harder to nail down, as we didn't really get to see a ton of her. We know she's tough and a bit unhinged, but besides that, we don't really get much information. Well, there is one additional piece of information we get. Yuki is a former plasma star vessel. Because her technique is Star Rage and she was a plasma star vessel, we can assume that her domain would also have something to do with stars. I think it would be a combat-centered lethal domain, as Star Rage is a hyper-offensive technique. This led me to the following domain: Star-Forming Nebula. In this domain, both Yuki and her opponent have a star below them. These stars constantly want to be drawn towards each other, as that is what gravity dictates. Because this domain is essentially Yuki's curse technique, when she increases her mass, the speed at which the stars are drawn towards each other also increases. This gravity effect acts as her sure hit, as she can draw her opponent towards herself faster than they can avoid. I think this concept fits really well for her. She is someone who always wants to force a fight, and being able to force interactions would be to her advantage. A domain like this would also fit Kenjaku's assessment of her domain, since he believed that Yuki was not confident in her domain's strength. This is because the effect of Star-Forming Nebula is a pretty bad matchup for curse manipulation, as it would essentially force Yuki to fight any cursed spirit that Kenjaku summons. While we're on the subject of special grades, let's talk about another one whose domain we have never seen: Yuta. When we look at Yuta's technique, I think there are two directions we can go with his domain. One where Rika is the focus, and one where copying is the focus. This is because it's kind of ambiguous whether his technique is Rika, as it says in the manga, or it's copy, as that seems to be the active technique. Because of these two possibilities, I'm going to develop two domains, one for each possibility. Let's start with the Rika domain, Funeral Wedding. Visually, this domain would be a wedding gazebo surrounded by graves, as I think this fits Yuta's history with love and his relationship with Rika. In this domain, Yuta creates a binding vow to trade his sure hit effect in order to gain access to the vengeful spirit cursed Rika and her boundless cursed energy. He's also still able to use his copy technique, so while in his domain he essentially has infinite cursed energy with which he can use any technique he has in his arsenal. And if this domain is activated while he has his full connection with Rika, the timer is suspended and will continue counting down once the domain ends. I don't think there would be any environmental effects in this domain, as it is already strong enough as is, and Yuta isn't a character known for any external effects besides being spooky. This domain would allow Yuta to win almost any domain battle he takes part in, as being able to fuel a domain with boundless cursed energy would allow it to overpower almost every domain it opposes. Obviously, there would still be issues when fighting with more refined domains, and it's likely that Sukuna's domain would still be able to break his barrier from the outside like it did for Gojo, but the amount of domains it would lose to are single digit at most. The other domain that I think would fit Yuta is Cursed Storeroom of Vitality. I think this would look like a storeroom with visualizations of Yuta's cursed techniques on the shelves. This domain does seem a bit lame visually, but to be completely honest, I couldn't think of anything else that would work with Yuta's technique. This domain would take Yuta's copying ability to the extreme, allowing him to copy the cursed technique of his opponent unconditionally, and allowing Rika to use any technique Yuta has already copied. However, there is a condition. If the battle is not won in the domain, Yuta loses access to the techniques he copied from opponents in the domain, but he does retain information he learned about the techniques, so he still has an advantage. Next, let's talk about the best big brother, Chozo. When we look at Chozo as a character, there are two things that become immediately apparent. He uses blood manipulation, and he loves his brothers. Because of these two factors, I think Chozo's domain would be Imminent Hemorrhage, the Wrath of a Brother. This domain would act similar to Megumi's, where he floods an arena with his blood, but unlike Megumi's, he would utilize a full barrier rather than relying on naturally occurring barriers. In this domain, Chozo would be able to manipulate his blood freely, and because there's nowhere for the blood to escape or any way for it to disconnect from his body, he can use any technique from any position. This means he could summon piercing blood from directly below his opponents, slow his opponents down by covering their clothes in blood, use Wing King to manipulate blood from a distance, and more. This is pretty simple, but I think it's because Chozo would have one of the more simple domains, as he seems to be a fairly straightforward guy who doesn't like to overcomplicate things. This domain would let him fight freely in the way that best fits his technique, as it removes blood manipulation's weaknesses and capitalizes on its strengths. Next is Todo, who is the first character that I believe would have a non-lethal domain. Unlike most characters in Jujutsu Kaisen, we already know what Todo's mental landscape looks like. If you remember, during his and Yuji's fight with Hanami, Todo had a pseudo-flashback where he talked to Takeda-chan in a middle school classroom. Because of how he interacted with her and how it was shown to be a part of his thought process, we can determine that this middle school classroom is Todo's mental landscape, and that Takeda-chan is a part of it. This brings me to the idea for his domain, School-Bound Romance. In this domain, Todo and his opponent fight to impress Takeda-chan by doing favors for her and answering her quiz questions, which could be anything about her. The person who impresses her the most gains a buff to their cursed energy output, and the loser loses their cursed technique or cursed energy when the domain closes. If one of the participants offends Takeda-chan, they will automatically lose, which would result in them losing their cursed energy and cursed technique, and the other person gaining an even larger buff to their cursed energy and, if applicable, their cursed technique. This domain would be a great fit for Todo, as he's likely more knowledgeable on Takeda-chan than the average sorcerer, but it's still decently risky due to the fact that he could lose the contest if he just happens to run into a sorcerer that is an even bigger fan of her than he is. Let's talk about Nanami for a bit. Much like Chozo, I think Nanami would have a very simple domain expansion, as he is a simple, no-nonsense kind of guy. I think his domain would be Tired Office of the Overworked, and it would be set in an office at night. There wouldn't be any environmental effects or anything in this domain. The main effect would instead be that every hit he lands is guaranteed to be a ratio hit, allowing him to attack with less precision and always hit extremely hard. Now, this is not a sure hit for him, and because his technique doesn't really allow for a sure hit, I think he would trade the sure hit effect of his domain for a greater chance of landing black flashes. Between the guaranteed ratios and the higher chance of hitting a black flash, I think Nanami would have a decent amount of power in this domain, especially if he can stack black flashes to increase his cursed energy output. Next, we have the final special grade who doesn't have a domain expansion, Geto. Geto is yet another sorcerer who I think would have a fairly simple domain expansion. Prison of the Wayward Souls is the perfect name for his domain. It works on two fronts, as cursed spirits are often compared and contrasted to the soul, especially considering how the orbs that Geto absorbs are visually similar to how souls are often represented in media, and since Geto is a bit of a wayward soul himself who was imprisoned by the responsibility of his cursed technique. Too edgy? Too bad. I like it. From a visual standpoint, I think it would look like the inside of a Philosopher's Stone from Fullmetal Alchemist, but instead of humanoid faces floating by, it's different cursed spirits. Geto's domain would make any cursed spirit used inside it gain a 50% buff to their overall strength. This would give him an advantage in general, but the real advantage would come from his guaranteed hit. Geto is one of the few characters in Jujutsu Kaisen who has a maximum technique, as he can create a maximum Uzumaki by combining all of his cursed spirits into one giant blast. I think making this maximum Uzumaki his sure hit would guarantee him a win if it needed to be used. We already saw what a mini Uzumaki could do to even a special grade, so imagine what a full maximum Uzumaki would do to a sorcerer, especially if all the cursed spirits involved are buffed by 50%. Now let's talk about some women, starting with Nobara. While Nobara is nowhere near strong enough to develop a domain expansion, I think her technique lends itself to a domain fairly well. Synergistic Nailed Coffin would be the name, and it would essentially look like the inside of an old wooden coffin. In this domain, all of Nobara's nails act as the sure hit effect, so they would all be able to home in on enemies, which would remove her need to aim. On top of this, when she activates either Straw Doll or Resonance, the other one also activates as well, so her techniques basically become one. This gives her a pretty decent buff, as it means that she can use the explosive power of Resonance much easier, and when combined with the homing aspect of her nails, they become a truly lethal object. Now we have a character that I think should definitely have a domain, Mei-Mei. Mei-Mei constantly talks about how she pushes herself and her technique to the absolute limit, but from what we've seen of her technique, that doesn't seem to include a domain for some reason. Maybe she just didn't believe her domain would have been stronger than the smallpox deity's domain and thus didn't cast it, but still, it seems a little bit unusual. Regardless, since we haven't seen hers yet, I've got you. Divine Birdcage is the name, and I think the effect would be quite simple. In this domain, Mei-Mei makes Bird Strike her sure hit, and considering the technique's strength, that alone would make it a pretty powerful domain. I also think she would gain control of any birds that are trapped within the domain that she didn't already have control of, since the domain is essentially the physical manifestation of a cursed technique. I think it would be really cool if the birds already under Mei-Mei's control were able to enter and exit the domain at will. This would require her effort to create a semi-permeable membrane for her domain, which sounds like quite a complex feat. But on the flip side, she is a very competent sorcerer, so I don't think it would be impossible for her to do. This could be the very reason we haven't seen her domain yet. Only time will tell. We only have 2 more characters that I want to talk about, and this one is Kashimo. Kashimo is a bit hard to develop a domain for, as his technique can only be used 1 time. This means that he can probably only use his domain once as well, but that means it should be super powerful. Being an ancient sorcerer and a sorcerer who uses lightning, I think it would make sense for him to draw inspiration from Michizane and his Rain of Lightning. As a result, I would give Kashimo Temple of Michizane for his domain. This domain would be a classic Japanese Buddhist temple, with a number of rods set in hexagonal patterns radiating from the center of the domain. It would be a pretty standard lethal domain, but what makes it extremely powerful is its sure hit effect, which allows Kashimo to launch electricity from one rod to another and to and from himself without the need to charge up like he usually does. This essentially lets the sorcerer hit anyone from anywhere with an extremely powerful attack that was capable of almost killing a sorcerer who had unlimited cursed energy. At a glance, this might seem too powerful, but remember, he can only use it 1 time. It will likely give him a guaranteed win over whoever he's facing, but his body will crumble right after, so it's probably better for him to just not use it in general. The last domain I want to talk about is Inumaki's, because I just had a really fun time coming up with this one. Inumaki as a person does not give off the vibes of someone who would have a lethal domain. He's pretty chill and laid back, so I think he would have a mostly non-lethal domain, and in this case I think there's only one direction we can go: a rap battle. This just makes sense for a cursed speech user. In this domain, Inumaki and his opponent would take turns with verses with cursed energy turned off, so Inumaki can speak without having to worry about the backlashes of cursed energy or accidentally hurting his opponent. However, this would be done via a binding vow, and as such, he also gains the ability to create rhyme schemes and roasts the likes of which have never been seen before, giving him a distinct advantage. The winner of the battle is determined by the will of the 2 combatants, so if one thinks they are close to losing, they will lose, and if one thinks they are overwhelmingly the winner, they will win. The verses would continue swapping until a loser is determined, and this loser takes more damage from the opponent's curse technique by a factor of 2 once the domain ends. It's not the strongest domain, but it feels like the most perfect domain for Inumaki, and I literally cannot think of any other options for the cursed speech user. If you're curious why I haven't talked about Yuji yet, it's because we still have no information on his curse technique. This makes it really hard to develop a domain of any kind. Sure, we could go with the classic boxing ring theory, but I don't think this is a great idea, as it doesn't really give Yuji an advantage in general, it just weakens the opponent. Because of this lack of information, I'm just not going to talk about Yuji. Sorry. And that's everyone. Let me know if you think there are any characters that could have domains in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again in just a week for another one.